It was 3 in the morning at a Washington motel. The freezing rain tapped against the thin window glass. Clara sat completely numb on the edge of the bed. She was 48 years old and had lost everything. An electrical fire had destroyed her art studio. Her ruined clothes still smelled heavily of bitter ash. Outside, a red neon sign flickered in the thick fog. The cramped room was suffocatingly quiet. Then 3 slow knocks echoed through the wooden door. Clara opened it and saw her estranged older sister. Evelyn stepped inside. Slowly, carefully. She didn't say hello. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't rush forward to offer a warm embrace. She didn't utter a single word. 19 years of total silence just walked right into that cheap motel room. And that silence didn't break. It just hung there, heavy, suffocating. It hovered right in the middle of the freezing, damp Washington air. Clara backed away instinctively. Her heart pounded aggressively against her ribs. She was entirely unable to process this impossible moment. Evelyn reached back. She pushed the thin wooden door shut. The rusty hinges whined softly. Then came the click of the deadbolt. A quiet, deliberate click. That sharp, metallic sound, it felt incredibly final. It sealed them together inside this depressing space. Just 2 strangers who used to be sisters. Think about that for a second. You would naturally expect screaming right now. You would expect desperate tears or violent anger. But the room remained dead quiet. Evelyn just stood there. She let the freezing rain drip off her dark trench coat. It fell onto the badly stained carpet, drop after drop. She was only 52 years old, but the harsh reality of her life had taken a massive toll. The bright, fiercely ambitious college student was entirely gone, completely erased by time. Deep lines of pure exhaustion were etched tightly around her mouth. Her pale skin carried the dull pallor of countless sleepless nights. She looked like a woman who had spent 2 decades constantly walking uphill, against the wind, in the dark. But here is the fascinating thing. Despite the faded canvas jacket she wore, despite the thick mud caked on her boots, Evelyn stood perfectly straight. Her spine was incredibly rigid. Her tired shoulders were pulled back tightly. She carried a quiet, unshakable dignity. It was the kind of dignity that commands immediate respect. She didn't look like a cowardly thief who ran away with the family money. She looked exactly like a weary soldier, someone who had survived a very long, brutal war. Clara desperately wanted to scream. She really did. She wanted to violently demand answers for 19 long years of agonizing pain. But the angry words just got stuck in her throat. The heavy tension in that room was simply too thick to cut. Evelyn finally raised her head. Clara looked directly into her older sister's eyes. They were incredibly dark, empty, hollow. There was absolutely no pity in them. There was no lingering shame either. Just a terrifying, chilling calm. It was the distinct look of someone who had already lost everything. Evelyn didn't judge the pathetic state of the motel room. She didn't flinch at the toxic smell of smoke on Clara's ruined clothes. She just kept her intense focus locked right onto Clara's face. Now listen carefully to this next part, because this is exactly where the entire narrative flips upside down. Evelyn slowly raised her stiff arms. She reached up to unbutton her wet coat. The flickering red neon light from the window suddenly caught her hands. Clara gasped out loud. Her breath hitched sharply. Those were absolutely not the smooth hands of a wealthy, selfish runaway. Evelyn's hands were rough. They were incredibly swollen. They were covered entirely in thick, white, ugly scars. The joints were permanently enlarged from aggressive physical trauma. Deep dirt was ground permanently into the calloused creases of her skin. One fingernail was completely blackened and split right down the middle. These were undeniably the hands of a blue-collar laborer. Working hands. Hands that scrubbed industrial floors. Hands that hauled heavy trash bags. Hands that washed dishes in boiling water for 14 years straight. The brutal violence of daily physical labor was permanently etched into her flesh. Clara stared blindly at those scars. A massive wave of pure confusion hit her hard. For 19 years, Clara pictured her sister living a glamorous life. Wealthy, comfortable, selfish. She fed her bitter anger with that exact image every single day. But this reality, standing in front of her, it made no sense. Evelyn didn't try to hide her damaged hands. She wasn't ashamed. Instead, she used them. She gripped the handle of a rusted suitcase. She took a slow, heavy step toward the wobbly wooden table. She moved like a woman whose bones constantly ached, but she never sighed. She lifted the suitcase. She set it down heavily. The peeling leather and rusted metal clasps looked ancient. Clara stood frozen in place. Evelyn rested her scarred palms flat against the wet leather. The deafening silence continued to stretch. Evelyn pressed her thumbs against the two rusted latches. The rusted latches on the suitcase did not open right away. Instead, Clara finally found her voice. It started as a hesitant, broken whisper, a shaky sound that quickly hardened into pure, unfiltered anger. She stepped away from the burned mattress. She looked directly at her older sister, the sister who simply vanished into thin air almost 2 complete decades ago. The deep resentment burned hot in her chest. It temporarily replaced the cold fear of the devastating fire. The overwhelming smell of wet ash faded behind a sudden rush of bitter adrenaline. Clara crossed her arms tightly across her chest, trying to physically hold herself together. 19 years, Clara said. Her voice trembled slightly, but she did not look away. You walk in here tonight, after 19 years of absolute unbroken silence. Not a single phone call, not a hastily written letter. Nothing. Evelyn did not flinch or look down. She just kept her calloused, scarred hands resting firmly on that rusted leather suitcase. Clara felt the hot, angry tears building in the corners of her eyes. She violently wiped them away with the back of her dirty, soot-stained hand. She was not going to cry. Not for her. Not after everything she had survived completely alone in this world. Where were you when Mom got really sick? Clara demanded loudly. Her volume rose, echoing sharply off the cheap motel walls. Where were you when the bank foreclosed on the family house? She took another frustrated, aggressive step forward. When I had to deal with the ruthless bankruptcy lawyers all by myself. The painful memories of crushing debt and relentless collection agencies flooded back instantly. The incredibly dark, lonely days of her early 20s, working 3 grueling jobs just to slowly pay off the massive financial mess their disgraced father left behind. She had built her precious art studio from absolutely nothing. She scraped together every single penny she could find. She painted cheap murals for local diners. She sold charcoal sketches on the cold city sidewalks. It took her over a decade of brutal hustle to finally feel financially stable, to finally feel somewhat safe. And tonight, she stood on the wet pavement and watched all of it burn to the ground. Every beautiful canvas, every expensive brush, gone in a terrifying flash of aggressive electrical sparks and thick smoke. And now her cowardly runaway sister miraculously shows up. You just packed your bags and ran away, Clara continued relentlessly. Her voice was incredibly sharp and deeply bitter. Why did you leave me to clean up the broken pieces? How could you let me bury her completely alone? Evelyn stood completely still in the dim neon light. She absorbed every single angry word without flinching. She did not offer a quick defensive excuse. She did not tell Clara to lower her voice or calm down. She just accepted the heavy, painful verbal blows. Her stoic, deeply weathered face simply remained an entirely unreadable, perfectly quiet mask. It was deeply infuriating. That absolute suffocating silence. Clara desperately wanted her older sister to yell back. She wanted a loud, messy argument. She wanted Evelyn to weakly justify her incredible selfishness. But the older woman just stood there, breathing incredibly slowly. Her heavily scarred hands remained firmly anchored to the wobbly wooden table. The cold Washington rain continued to hit the thin glass window outside. The broken neon sign flashed steadily in the foggy darkness. Red, then dark. Red, then dark. Clara let out a hollow, profoundly exhausted laugh. The fierce fight suddenly drained right out of her weary bones. She was simply too tired to be angry anymore. The adrenaline faded rapidly, leaving only a deep, hollow, painful ache. But listen carefully to this next part, because what happened here changes everything. Evelyn finally shifted her weight slightly. She did not argue back. She did not offer a meaningless apology to defend herself. She just pressed her calloused thumbs down hard and pushed those two rusted brass latches upward. The heavy metallic lock clicked loudly in the tiny, quiet room. The metallic click echoed loudly. The rusted latches finally popped open. Evelyn slowly lifted the heavy leather lid. It creaked like an old, forgotten door. The smell of the suitcase hit the room immediately. It didn't smell like fresh, crisp $100 bills. It didn't smell like a brand new start. It smelled like damp basements, like old dust and cheap cardboard boxes. Clara slowly leaned forward just a little bit. She couldn't help it. Basic human curiosity is an incredibly powerful thing. She fully expected to see stacks of stolen cash. She expected to see the missing family fortune. The money she always assumed Evelyn took. The money that funded her supposed glamorous escape to somewhere far away. But the old suitcase was absolutely not filled with cash. It wasn't filled with expensive clothes or fancy jewelry. There was absolutely no stolen treasure inside that old leather box. There was no magical, instant fix for Clara's burned-down life. Just pure, bitter disappointment. Evelyn reached her scarred hands inside. She didn't hesitate for a second. She knew exactly what she was grabbing in the dim dark. She pulled out a massive stack of thick yellowed paper. She dropped the massive heavy stack right onto the cheap wobbly motel table. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. A small cloud of ancient dust puffed into the neon light. Evelyn reached in and pulled out another thick stack. Thud. Then another. Thud. Soon the entire small table was completely covered. It was simply just paper. Hundreds and hundreds of incredibly old pages. Clara stared at the messy piles, in total confusion. The thin edges of the pages were severely curled and heavily brown. Some were bound with rusty paper clips. Others were shoved tightly into faded manila folders. The musty smell grew much stronger now. It smelled exactly like a closed, forgotten archive. Clara nervously stepped a tiny bit closer to the table. She looked down at the top page of the nearest pile. Her eyes darted across the bold black text at the top. It was a very formal legal heading. It was from the United States District Court. She recognized the terrifying formatting immediately. The bold, heavy black lines, the dense, confusing legal jargon. She saw the familiar, dreaded stamp of the Federal Bankruptcy Court. There were several official notices of property foreclosure. There were aggressive letters from ruthless debt collection agencies. She saw formal federal asset freeze orders. These were the exact same terrifying documents that haunted her early 20s. These were the exact papers that completely destroyed their family. They were the cold, hard proof of their father's massive financial crimes. The absolute, unforgiving nightmare that broke them. Why exactly did Evelyn have these? Why did she carry them around for almost 2 decades? Clara felt a sudden, sharp spike of renewed anger. It felt like a cruel, sick joke. She literally just lost her entire art studio tonight. Her whole life just went up in smoke a few hours ago. And now her older sister shows up just to dump their past trauma on the table, to forcibly remind her of the absolute worst time in their lives. The time they lost the big suburban house. The time they lost their mother to stress and sickness. Clara wanted to sweep all those hateful papers right onto the dirty floor. She deeply wanted to scream at Evelyn to pack her trash and leave, right now. She fiercely glared at her older sister. Evelyn was just staring down at the faded manila folders. She looked incredibly tired. She looked like she had carried the physical weight of those papers on her back. Clara took a deep breath to start yelling again. She was totally ready to explode. She was ready to kick her sister out into the freezing Washington rain. But wait, here is exactly where things get really interesting. Now listen carefully to this next part. Evelyn slowly, deliberately reached out with her ruined right hand. She didn't touch the big stacks of foreclosure notices. She didn't point at the terrifying bankruptcy filings. Instead, she gently tapped a thin, perfectly plain blue folder. It was sitting quietly right at the very bottom of the mess. It looked completely different from the rest of the aggressive legal trash. It didn't have a big federal court stamp on the front. It just had a few handwritten words. Evelyn tapped it twice. She finally slowly looked up. She met Clara's angry eyes directly. The suffocating silence of the room shifted. It felt heavier. It felt significantly more dangerous. Clara looked down at that thin blue folder. Her racing heart suddenly skipped a heavy beat. Something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. The truth was hiding there, in plain sight. Clara stared at that thin blue folder. Her mind violently pulled her backward in time. 19 years ago, their comfortable lives had shattered completely overnight. They had lived in a beautiful suburban house with a massive oak tree in the front yard. Their father was a highly respected investment banker in their quiet community. He was the pillar of their local church. He sponsored Little League baseball teams every single spring. He was the kind of man who hosted lavish neighborhood barbecues every Sunday afternoon. Everyone loved him, and everyone implicitly trusted him. The betrayal cut deeper because nobody ever saw it coming, not even his own family. But that deep trust was nothing more than a carefully constructed, incredibly beautiful lie. The federal investigators showed up on a cold Tuesday morning, wearing dark suits. They completely tore that beautiful house apart, looking for hidden financial records. It turned out their beloved father had been running a massive corporate fraud scheme for years. He had stolen millions of dollars from innocent, hard-working people. The fallout from that day was absolutely catastrophic for their entire family. The local media camped outside their driveway for weeks like hungry wolves. Their mother simply could not handle the crushing, deeply public humiliation. Her health deteriorated rapidly under the immense weight of the massive scandal. But the absolute worst part of that entire nightmare was Evelyn. Right before the heavy federal indictments came down, a huge sum of missing money completely vanished. And so did Evelyn. She packed a single bag in the middle of the night and left without a word. The story wrote itself perfectly for the hungry news reporters. Everyone immediately assumed the smart, ambitious older sister took the hidden cash and ran away. She became the greedy, selfish daughter who abandoned her sick mother and her teenage sister. Clara had carried that painful, ugly story inside her heart for nearly 2 decades. It was the only logical explanation that ever made any sense to her at the time. The cruel rumors spread through their small town like a fast, aggressive wildfire. Clara had to change her last name just to apply for an honest job without being constantly judged. It was a suffocating, heavy shadow that followed her absolutely everywhere. People constantly whispered about it in the grocery store aisles when she walked past. Former friends offered Clara those terrible, deeply pitying looks whenever she saw them in town. They all believed Evelyn was a coward who traded her family for stolen wealth. She convinced herself that Evelyn was sipping expensive wine on some beautiful distant beach. Have you ever judged someone completely based on the messy surface of a terrible tragedy? We all do it because anger is so much easier to handle than the complicated truth. Clara used that bitter anger to survive her darkest, most difficult days alone. She used the intense hatred of her sister as fuel to build her art studio. She truly believed she was the strong, fiercely loyal daughter who stayed behind to endure the brutal storm. She looked at Evelyn standing in that cheap motel room right now. The exhausted woman with the heavily scarred hands did not match the wealthy runaway narrative. The math of the last 19 years simply was not adding up correctly anymore. If Evelyn had taken all that stolen corporate money, she would not be wearing muddy boots. Why did her aging face hold the deep, unmistakable hollows of someone who had suffered immensely? Clara's confused eyes drifted slowly back down to that plain blue folder on the wobbly table. Evelyn kept her scarred hand resting gently, right next to it in the dim light. The heavy, oppressive silence in the room suddenly felt incredibly fragile. It felt exactly like the terrifying calm right before a massive world-altering storm hits. Now listen carefully to this next part, because the absolute truth is rarely what we assume it is. The tragic story Clara had fiercely believed her entire adult life was about to be completely destroyed. Clara stared straight down at the very thin, quiet, unassuming blue folder. Evelyn then slowly flipped the heavy cardboard cover wide open. The bright red neon light suddenly illuminated the crisp top page. It was a formal bank transfer authorization document from their past. Clara immediately recognized the specific date stamped at the top. It was the exact day their entire suburban world collapsed. It was the terrible day the missing money vanished forever. Evelyn pressed her thick, heavily scarred index finger firmly down. She pointed directly at the fading black ink signature line. Clara leaned in closer to read the old, messy cursive. It was absolutely not Evelyn's neat, careful, precise handwriting. It was their disgraced father's rushed, incredibly sloppy signature. He had personally forged the massive transfer to an offshore account. He desperately tried to hide his stolen corporate funds from investigators. Evelyn had never touched a single shiny dime of that money. The shocking realization hit Clara like a heavy physical blow. The incredibly selfish runaway sister narrative was an entire fiction. It was a carefully constructed, completely fabricated and painful lie. Evelyn kept her heavy, scarred hand flat on the wobbly table. Her voice finally broke the suffocating, tense silence in the room. It was low, incredibly raspy, and completely remarkably steady. She stated the cold, hard facts of that terrible, chaotic week. The federal investigators were absolutely furious and incredibly aggressive. They were actively planning to completely freeze every single family asset. They wanted to seize every bank account bearing their ruined surname. That aggressive federal financial sweep included something incredibly important to Clara. It included her newly awarded prestigious university art scholarship fund. It also included her small, dedicated educational trust account. The ruthless federal agents were going to take it all away. Clara would have been left with absolutely nothing to her name. Her bright, promising future in the art world would have vanished. She would have been just another penniless victim of their father. Evelyn simply could not let that terrible, unfair thing happen to her sibling. She made a brutally hard, completely life-altering permanent decision. She deliberately walked right into the busy federal prosecutor's downtown office. She sat down in a cold, grey, intimidating interrogation room. She voluntarily signed a completely false, legally binding, detailed criminal confession. She explicitly claimed she helped move the stolen corporate money offshore. She intentionally made herself the primary, most obvious criminal target. But here is where the story gets incredibly interesting for everyone in the room. The greedy local media eagerly took the exciting, highly scandalous bait. The angry public completely focused their intense, bitter hatred on Evelyn. The federal investigators suddenly shifted their entire aggressive financial probe. They blindly chased the older sister who supposedly ran away with the money. They completely stopped looking into the younger sister's very modest accounts. Clara's precious art scholarship remained completely safe and entirely untouched. Her small educational trust fund quietly cleared the intensive federal audit. The massive legal system simply moved on from the innocent teenager. Evelyn completely sacrificed her own pristine, spotless, and perfect reputation. She actively destroyed her own promising, bright, and secure future. She willingly accepted the ugly, permanent title of a selfish thief. She let her own family deeply, passionately, and permanently hate her. She let Clara build a massive wall of bitter cold resentment. She did all of this without uttering a single solitary complaint. She did it so Clara could firmly hold onto her dreams, so Clara could buy expensive canvases and high-quality oil paints, so Clara could eventually build that beautiful, now ruined art studio. Evelyn traded her own personal freedom for Clara's safe, protected future. She became a ghost to ensure Clara could actually truly shine. Clara felt her knees grow incredibly weak and dangerously unsteady. The dark, heavy motel room suddenly felt like it was spinning. 19 years of burning, intense hatred completely evaporated in 1 second. It was instantly replaced by an overwhelming, crushing sense of absolute guilt. She had spent 2 decades fiercely loathing a true silent protector. She had bitterly cursed the very woman who secretly saved her life. Evelyn had absorbed all the brutal, ugly, terrifying consequences entirely alone. She never once asked for a tiny shred of human gratitude. She never sought any public validation for her massive, heartbreaking sacrifice. She just silently took the painful, heavy fall for her sister. She let Clara live a clean, untainted, and incredibly beautiful life. Evelyn just watched the cold rain hit the thin motel window. She stood there quietly in her cheap, wet, faded canvas coat. She was the absolute, undeniable definition of pure, selfless, unconditional love. The absolute truth of this quiet sacrifice was incredibly and unbelievably heavy today. Evelyn did not pause to let the shocking truth settle in the room. She slowly moved that thin blue folder off to the side of the table. She reached much deeper into the dark bottom of the rusted suitcase. Her scarred hands pulled out several thick bundles of small white envelopes. They were tightly bound together with brittle, snapping yellow rubber bands. Clara looked closely at the faded red ink stamped on the corners. It was the official mail seal of the State Women's Correctional Facility. Evelyn had not been sipping expensive cocktails on some beautiful tropical beach. She had spent 5 agonizing years locked inside a freezing concrete cell. She served a massive federal sentence for a crime she never committed. Those bundles contained hundreds of handwritten letters addressed directly to Clara. Evelyn had carefully written 1 single letter every single night before bed. She wrote them while sitting on a hard steel cot in the freezing dark. She wrote about how incredibly proud she was of Clara's new college scholarship. She wrote about missing the simple smell of fresh oil paints. She poured her entire broken heart onto those cheap prison notepad pages. Clara felt a massive lump form painfully deep inside her dry throat. She reached out and gently touched the top envelope with trembling fingers. The paper felt incredibly brittle and fragile under her soot-stained fingertips. If Evelyn wrote all these letters, why did they never arrive in the mail? Why did Clara spend 5 years feeling completely abandoned and utterly alone? Evelyn saw the painful, unasked question burning clearly in her sister's eyes. Now listen carefully, because this is where the sacrifice becomes truly unimaginable. Evelyn's public defender had given her one piece of incredibly strict legal advice. He told her that any contact with Clara would instantly ruin everything. If a convicted federal felon sent letters to a university student, people would talk. The aggressive journalists would absolutely track the prison return address down. They would relentlessly drag Clara's clean name right back into the ugly mud. The university might panic and completely revoke her prestigious art scholarship. They would instantly cut off her essential funding and ruin her future. So Evelyn made the agonizing choice to keep every single letter completely hidden. She willingly accepted the absolute crushing silence of solitary confinement to protect Clara. She absorbed all of the punishing, brutal loneliness entirely by herself. She slowly slipped one envelope out from under a dry rubber band. Her calloused thumbs carefully unfolded the thin, heavily yellowed sheet of paper. Her raspy voice echoed softly in the quiet, damp Washington motel room. She read the faded words she had written 19 long years ago. I know you probably hate me right now, and that is totally okay, but please use that fierce anger to push yourself incredibly hard every single day. Paint the beautiful world you actually deserve to see, not this ugly one. I am always sitting right there in the front row cheering for you, even if you can never see me sitting in the dark audience. Clara completely broke down listening to that raw, incredibly pure emotional confession. The massive, heavy dam of bitter resentment finally shattered into a million pieces. The painful tears she had held back for almost 2 decades finally fell. They mixed directly with the dark grey ash still clinging to her face. She realized Evelyn had never abandoned her in the cold dark. Her older sister had simply built a silent fortress to keep her safe. The painful distance between them was not built out of cruel, selfish betrayal. It was constructed entirely out of fierce, deeply protective and unconditional sisterly love. The profound healing truth was sitting right there on the wobbly wooden table. Clara wept, quietly, mourning the massive amount of lost time between them. She finally understood the incredible, unbearable weight her sister had carried alone. Every single unsent letter was a quiet, desperate testament to true devotion. Evelyn had given up absolutely everything to buy Clara a chance. Evelyn finally set the stack of faded yellow envelopes gently down. They rested quietly, right next to the intimidating blue legal folder. The terrible secret of those 5 lost years was now fully out in the open. But 5 years in a federal prison only brings us to year 5 of the 19. Clara sat completely frozen on the edge of the ruined motel bed. She desperately wiped the hot, stinging tears from her soot-stained cheeks. What exactly happened during the incredibly long 14 years after she got out? Evelyn reached back into the dusty bottom of the old leather suitcase. She pulled out a thick, messy stack of tiny wrinkled paper slips. They were held together with a very cheap, rusty binder clip. She dropped them onto the wobbly table right in front of Clara. Clara leaned forward again and squinted closely in the harsh, flickering red neon light. She carefully read the faded black print on the top slip of paper. It was a very standard, incredibly cheap, minimum wage pay stub. It was from a late-night industrial cleaning company operating way out in the distant suburbs. Clara slowly flipped to the next small slip of paper. It was a wrinkled receipt from a busy, greasy downtown diner. Evelyn had worked there as a dishwasher, scrubbing heavily crusted plates for incredibly long hours. Clara kept flipping through the massive stack of paper with trembling fingers. She saw endless pay stubs from terrible, physically demanding, completely unglamorous jobs. She saw receipts from overnight warehouse stocking shifts. She saw evidence of brutal, back-breaking landscaping work in the blistering summer heat. Now listen closely, because this highlights the brutal reality of the American justice system. When you walk out of prison with a felony record permanently attached to your name, you don't get a fresh start. You definitely don't walk back into a nice, comfortable office job. Corporate America completely shuts its heavy, expensive glass doors right in your face. Evelyn had absolutely no chance of ever rebuilding her bright, promising professional career. She was forced to take the absolute hardest, most invisible jobs in the city. The jobs that literally nobody else ever wants to do. The jobs that slowly and methodically break your body down, day after painful day. Evelyn had spent 14 entire years living deep in the grueling, invisible shadows of the working class. While Clara was proudly hosting glamorous, expensive gallery openings in the bustling city centre, Evelyn was there too. Evelyn was likely emptying the overflowing, smelly trash cans in the cold alley right behind the building. While Clara was confidently shaking hands with wealthy, sophisticated art collectors, Evelyn was completely exhausted. Evelyn was probably scrubbing heavily stained industrial floors on her aching, swollen knees. The stark, undeniable contrast between their 2 dramatically different lives was absolutely heart-wrenching. Clara had spent over a decade bitterly resenting her sister for supposedly living a life of stolen luxury. She had convinced herself that Evelyn was selfishly enjoying the fruits of their disgraced father's terrible crimes. But Evelyn had actually been quietly drowning in the brutal, exhausting reality of minimum wage survival. She had traded her pristine, beautiful hands for severe calluses and deep, permanent scars. Clara looked up from the massive pile of cheap pay stubs. She looked directly at her sister's ruined, heavily damaged hands again. The deep, dark dirt embedded permanently in her skin, the swollen, painful joints, the blackened, severely split fingernail. Suddenly, those ugly, brutal scars didn't look like shameful signs of failure anymore. They looked exactly like incredibly hard-won badges of absolute, undeniable honor. Evelyn had fiercely rebuilt her entire broken life with intense, honest, incredibly exhausting physical labor. She had not relied on a single stolen dime to survive the last 14 years. She had earned every single penny with pure, honest, exhausting sweat. There is a very specific, quiet kind of greatness in that level of sheer, unrelenting determination. It is a profound, undeniable dignity that absolutely no amount of stolen money can ever buy. Clara felt a massive surge of profound, deep, and overwhelming respect for the woman standing before her. Evelyn had survived the absolute worst of the world, and she had done it completely cleanly. Clara kept sifting through the messy pile of cheap pay stubs. Her trembling fingers pushed the greasy diner receipts away. Something entirely different caught her eye near the bottom. It was a crisp, white piece of paper. It looked completely out of place in that dirty stack. It was a faded carbon copy of a cashier's check. Clara carefully pulled it out from the messy pile. She stared closely at the printed black numbers. Her breath suddenly caught sharply in her throat. The stamped date was exactly 7 years ago. The total amount was exactly $4,000. She clearly remembered that specific terrifying month so vividly. Her small, struggling art studio was failing completely miserably. The ruthless local bank was actively threatening immediate eviction. She had been absolutely terrified of suddenly losing everything. Then, a miraculous anonymous donation arrived in her daily mail. It saved her entire struggling business completely overnight. She always assumed some wealthy, sophisticated art collector sent it, someone who deeply admired her beautiful, creative gallery work. But the undeniable proof of that check was right here. It was sitting right inside Evelyn's rusted, battered suitcase. Clara frantically dug deeper into the remaining pile of papers. She found another carbon copy of a money order. This one was from almost 9 full years ago. It was for incredibly expensive, high-quality oil paints. She remembered finding a massive box of supplies outside her door. There was absolutely no return address on that delivery, just a blank white card taped firmly to the top. Clara found another receipt for a late loan payment. Then she found another one, covering her winter heating bill. There were dozens of these mysterious, anonymous payment records. But wait, here is where it gets completely heartbreaking. Evelyn had literally scrubbed toxic industrial floors on her knees. She washed thousands of dirty dishes in boiling hot water. She broke her aging body down for minimum wage. And she did not keep that hard-earned money. She secretly funneled almost every single spare dollar to Clara. She funded her younger sister's beautiful, glamorous art career. She paid Clara's bills while living in absolute grinding poverty. Evelyn never took a single ounce of credit for it. She let Clara believe in some magical, wealthy secret patron. She let Clara praise a total stranger for saving her. Meanwhile, Clara fiercely hated the actual person keeping her afloat. That realization crashed over Clara like a heavy physical weight. True unconditional love does not demand any loud public recognition. It does not ask for grateful tears or warm hugs. It operates silently in the absolute darkest, coldest shadows. It simply gives everything until there is absolutely nothing left. Evelyn, gave her own blood and sweat to buy time. Clara looked down at the pile of life-saving receipts. Then she looked back up at her tired older sister. Evelyn was still standing there in her wet canvas coat. She was still shivering slightly from the freezing Washington rain. She had literally bankrupted her own body to fund dreams. She had accepted Clara's bitter hatred as the permanent cost. She never once knocked on the door to demand thanks. She just quietly paid the heavy toll from a distance. This was the absolute highest form of human sacrifice. Most people only give when they know they get praised. They want their name boldly engraved on a shiny plaque. Evelyn just wanted her little sister to paint beautiful pictures. She wanted Clara to succeed in a cruel, unfair world, and she was totally willing to be the villain forever. As long as Clara's story had a happy, beautiful ending, the immense scale of that silent devotion was completely overwhelming. Clara could barely comprehend the staggering truth on that table. The red neon light outside flickered one more time. Clara gripped the old receipts tightly in her shaking hands. Her chest heaved with deep, uncontrollable and painful sobs. The phantom secret patron was finally standing right before her. She was a sister who had never actually run away. Clara stared blindly at the pile of receipts. Her vision blurred completely. A massive, suffocating wave of deep realization crashed over her. It physically knocked the wind right out of her lungs. Her legs gave out completely. She slowly sank down onto the stained motel carpet. The rough, dirty fabric scratched against her bare knees. She couldn't even feel it. The entire foundation of her life had just completely shattered. For 19 years, she firmly believed she was the strong one. She proudly wore her painful survival story like a shiny badge. She thought she was the incredibly brave sister who stayed behind. The sister who fiercely weathered the terrible family storm all alone. But that was a completely arrogant, intensely stupid lie. How could she have been so incredibly blind? How did she never stop to question the convenient, ugly story? Why did she just instantly assume the absolute worst about Evelyn? She let the greedy, sensational local news completely shape her reality. She let the cruel, whispering neighbors dictate her deep family resentment. She had spent 2 decades fiercely guarding her own angry ego. Evelyn had spent those exact same decades silently bleeding out for her. The sheer, overwhelming scale of her own painful arrogance was crushing. She had proudly built her entire identity on a massive, heartbreaking falsehood. She had aggressively painted herself as the ultimate tragic hero. Meanwhile, the actual hero was scrubbing dirty diner plates at midnight. Clara buried her face deep into her ash-covered hands. Deep, uncontrollable sobs violently shook her entire tired body. The bitter smell of the recent fire was completely gone now. It was entirely replaced by the heavy, suffocating scent of profound guilt. She thought about every single angry, hateful thought she ever had. Every time she bitterly cursed Evelyn's name during a hard month. Every time she proudly told someone her older sister abandoned her. Each memory felt exactly like a sharp, twisting knife in her gut. She had brutally punished the absolute only person who truly loved her. Now, listen closely, because this is the hardest part of the truth. True healing doesn't happen when someone else simply apologizes to you. True lasting healing only happens when your own massive ego completely dies. It happens when you finally admit you were completely devastatingly wrong. Clara didn't try to make any weak, pathetic excuses for her blindness. She didn't try to blame their disgraced father or the harsh media. She owned every single ounce of her terrible 19-year mistake. She slowly looked up from the dirty, damp motel floor. Evelyn was still standing, perfectly still, by the wobbly wooden table. The flickering red neon light caught the deep lines on her face. She didn't look angry. She didn't look vindicated or fiercely triumphant. She just looked incredibly tired and incredibly sad. Clara slowly crawled forward across the rough, stained carpet. She didn't care how pathetic or completely broken she looked right now. She stopped right at her older sister's scuffed, muddy leather boots. She slowly reached up with incredibly shaking, hesitant hands. She gently took Evelyn's right hand in both of hers. She felt the thick, hard calluses pressing against her soft palms. She traced the deep, permanent scars with her trembling thumb. She felt the permanently swollen joints that ached in the cold rain. This damaged hand had literally bought her entire, comfortable, beautiful life. Clara pressed her wet, tear-stained cheek against those rough scars. She wept openly, pouring out 19 years of incredibly misplaced, toxic anger. She didn't offer a dramatic, wordy apology because words were entirely useless here. She simply knelt there in the dim red light, completely broken open. Evelyn finally moved. Her other scarred hand slowly descended. It gently rested on top of Clara's shaking, ash-covered head. Clara stayed on the floor. She just cried quietly against her sister's scarred hands. 19 years of heavy toxic pain was actively pouring out of her. Evelyn didn't say a single word. She just let her sister completely break down. The red neon light outside finally stopped flickering. It just burned a steady, dull crimson color through the rain. The entire motel room felt incredibly different now. It didn't feel cheap and utterly depressing anymore. It felt like a quiet, a sacred space of absolute truth. A heavy, invisible burden had finally been lifted entirely. Eventually, Clara's deep, painful sobs started to slow down. She took a long, shaky breath and wiped her eyes. She slowly pushed herself back up off the damp carpet. Her knees were incredibly stiff and aching badly. She stood up and looked back at the small table. The rusted suitcase was still sitting completely open. It looked like a hollow, dark and empty mouth. Almost every single piece of paper was out. All the painful legal files, all the beautiful unsent letters, all the cheap, minimum wage diner receipts. The entire devastating story was scattered everywhere. But wait. Here is where the story takes its final incredible turn. Evelyn reached back into the dark suitcase one very last time. She didn't pull out another messy stack of old papers. She didn't pull out another brutal reminder of the difficult past. She reached her heavily scarred hand right down to the very bottom. Her thick fingers felt around the torn leather lining. She carefully pulled out one single crisp manila envelope. It looked completely new. It was not yellowed, faded, or covered in thick dust. It was completely untouched by time or tragic history. She gently laid the fresh envelope right on top of the pile. She didn't push it aggressively toward Clara. She just let it sit quietly on the wobbly table. The heavy, pregnant silence returned to the small room. But this silence was entirely different from before. It wasn't built out of bitter anger or deep resentment. It was built purely out of intense, quiet anticipation. Clara looked down at the completely plain envelope. Her racing heart started to beat incredibly fast again. What else could possibly be hidden inside this old suitcase? Clara nervously reached out with a trembling hand. She carefully flipped open the small metal clasp. She slid her fingers inside and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was an official, perfectly legal property deed. It had incredibly fresh, bright blue ink stamped right at the bottom. It explicitly stated that the property was completely paid off in full. Clara stared blankly at the formal legal address printed on the top line. It wasn't located in the busy, glamorous, incredibly expensive downtown art district. It wasn't a massive multi-million-dollar luxury high-rise apartment building. It was located way out in the quiet, distant, very rural suburbs. It was a very specific address she actually remembered seeing online recently. It was a small, abandoned greenhouse sitting on an overgrown piece of land. It was exactly the kind of place that needed massive amounts of hard work. It needed serious cleaning, fresh paint, and probably completely new plumbing. But it had massive, beautiful glass walls that let in incredible natural sunlight. It was the absolute perfect, quiet place to start over from nothing. It was the perfect place to build a brand new art studio. Clara felt a hard, heavy object slide out of the envelope. It fell directly into the palm of her dirty hand. It was a single, heavy, solid brass key. It was cold to the touch and slightly tarnished around the edges. She stared at the small metal key sitting in her hand. It felt incredibly heavy, like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She traced the jagged, uneven teeth with her thumb. This wasn't just a simple key to a dusty, abandoned greenhouse. It was literally the key to her entire future. It was a completely clean, totally debt-free, perfectly fresh start. Evelyn had quietly purchased this small property in cash. She had literally saved every single minimum wage penny to buy it. She bought a broken greenhouse so Clara could finally paint in the sun. Clara just stared at the heavy brass key. It sat incredibly cold and solid in her dirty palm. She looked back up at her older sister. Evelyn still had that quiet, incredibly stoic look on her tired face. But the terrifying hollow emptiness in her dark eyes was completely gone now. It was replaced by a very soft, profound sense of deep, hard-won peace. She had finally dropped the massive, invisible burden she carried for 19 years. She didn't have to desperately hide in the ugly, bitter shadows anymore. The terrible, suffocating secrets were completely out in the open. They were scattered all over that wobbly, cheap motel table. Evelyn took a very slow, deep breath. The damp air rattled slightly in her exhausted, aging chest. She finally spoke the longest, most complete sentence of the entire long night. Her raspy voice was incredibly gentle, like she was talking to a frightened child. I heard the terrible news about your art studio fire on the late evening broadcast. She paused and looked down at her own ruined, heavily scarred hands. I saw the horrible smoke still rising from the downtown building on the TV screen. She gently rubbed her calloused thumb across her deeply split, blackened fingernail. I honestly thought about just sending you this heavy envelope anonymously in the morning mail. Clara shook her head quickly, totally desperate to understand her sister's thought process. Why would she continue to hide after doing something so incredibly generous and beautiful? Why wouldn't she want Clara to finally know the absolute healing truth? Evelyn saw the deep, painful confusion written all over Clara's tear-stained face. She offered a very small, incredibly weak but entirely genuine smile. I was always so deeply ashamed to stand right in front of you, Clara. She gestured quietly to her heavily stained, incredibly faded canvas work jacket. Look at me. Look at what I actually became to simply survive in this world. You became a convicted felon because of me, Clara whispered back, her voice violently breaking. You completely destroyed your entire life so I could comfortably build mine. Evelyn shook her head very slowly, firmly, rejecting that painful, tragic narrative. No, I made a very clear, deliberate choice to strictly protect the only family I had left. She took a small step closer to her younger sister in the dim red neon light. But it took me 14 incredibly long, brutally hard years of physical labor after I got out. She pointed directly at the heavy brass key sitting in Clara's open, shaking hand. It took exactly 14 years of scrubbing dirty diner floors and hauling heavy trash. Now listen carefully, because this is the absolute core of her massive sacrifice. It took that long to quietly save enough, completely honest, perfectly clean money, Evelyn said softly. I desperately needed to buy that specific property in cash without any messy bank loans. She looked deeply into Clara's wide, completely shocked and incredibly tearful eyes. I simply couldn't come back into your beautiful, successful life completely empty-handed, Clara. She straightened her tired shoulders, proudly reclaiming her undeniable, hard-earned dignity. I needed to make absolutely sure the terrible dirt from our father's massive crimes was washed away. I waited until I could proudly hand you something entirely, completely clean. She pointed at the key again. That old greenhouse isn't much right now, but the foundation is incredibly solid. She offered another small, gentle smile that completely transformed her tired, aging face. It gets the absolute best morning sunlight for mixing your beautiful, expensive oil paints. Evelyn took one final slow step forward and stood directly in front of her sister. The massive debt is finally paid in full. The terrible past is officially dead and buried tonight. She gently closed Clara's dirty fingers tightly around the cold brass key. This brand new start belongs entirely to you. You earned it by surviving. The profound, incredible weight of those beautiful words settled completely over the tiny motel room. Evelyn had not stayed away because she fiercely hated her younger sister. She had stayed away because she profoundly respected Clara far too much. She refused to drag her dirty, complicated, messy survival story into Clara's clean world. She patiently waited in the dark until she could offer a perfect, untainted gift. She literally scrubbed the ugly sins of their father away with her own bare hands. She bought their ultimate freedom with 14 years of brutal, exhausting minimum wage sweat. The incredibly heavy brass key in Clara's hand suddenly felt incredibly warm and intensely alive. It was the absolute, undeniable physical proof of pure, unconditional, and fiercely protective love. Clara held that heavy brass key. Her entire body shook. 19 years is a massive, incredibly complex gap to bridge. It is filled with deep resentment, countless misunderstandings, and so much painful silence. But in that tiny, incredibly dingy motel room, the heavy gap completely vanished. Clara didn't bother offering a long, complicated, dramatic speech. She didn't try to find the perfect, most eloquent words to say, because there simply are no words big enough for this exact moment. Words are completely useless when faced with 14 years of silent sacrifice. She just stepped forward. She wrapped her arms tightly around her older sister. It was the very first embrace they had shared in almost 2 decades. Evelyn felt incredibly stiff and totally rigid at first. Her aging body was completely unaccustomed to physical warmth or sudden affection. She had spent 14 brutal years living in total isolating and quiet self-exile. But then very slowly Evelyn let out a long, deeply exhausted breath. The incredibly stiff, defensive posture finally melted away completely. She carefully wrapped her scarred, calloused hands around Clara's shaking back. She pulled her younger sister in tightly, burying her face in Clara's shoulder. The embrace was incredibly fierce, desperate, and totally unpolished. It wasn't one of those gentle, polite hugs you give casual friends. It was the deep, bone-crushing hug of 2 people who survived a terrible war. Clara could distinctly smell the damp, freezing Washington rain on Evelyn's coat. She could smell the stale, cheap coffee from the late-night diner shifts. She could feel the hard, unforgiving muscle built by years of manual labor. And she didn't care about the mud or the deeply stained canvas jacket. She just held on incredibly tightly, completely terrified to ever let go again. The red neon light continued to cast long, strange shadows across the small room. The freezing rain kept tapping rhythmically against the very thin, cheap window glass. But the space inside finally felt incredibly safe, warm, and totally secure. The crushing, suffocating tension was finally completely and permanently gone. They stood there in absolute comforting silence for a very long time. They just let the incredibly heavy, complicated weight of the past fade away. In America, we talk a lot about the massive power of a second chance. We deeply love stories about total redemption and incredibly fresh starts. But true redemption doesn't usually happen under bright, glamorous, flashing lights. It usually happens in incredibly quiet, extremely unglamorous, and easily forgotten places. It happens in cheap highway motels at 3 o'clock in the cold morning. It happens when you finally decide to completely let go of your proud ego. When you finally choose deep, unconditional forgiveness over incredibly comfortable, familiar anger. Clara realized she had lost an art studio, but she had gained her entire family back. The fire took all her expensive canvases, but it brought Evelyn home. It was an incredibly steep price, but it was absolutely worth it. Evelyn slowly pulled back, keeping her scarred hands firmly on Clara's shoulders. She looked at Clara with those dark, tired, but incredibly peaceful eyes. The profound, haunting emptiness was completely replaced by a very quiet, steady warmth. They didn't need to loudly hash out every single painful detail of the past. The messy, complicated truth was already sitting right there on the wobbly table. The old, incredibly painful debts were officially paid in full. The incredibly deep, ugly wounds were finally, truly, and completely clean. They were just two sisters, standing together, totally ready to finally begin again. The red neon sign finally flickered out in the morning. It made a small, dying, buzzing sound against the wall. Then everything went perfectly quiet for a short moment now. The sun began to climb slowly over the mountains today. A pale golden light touched the thin window glass now. It slowly fought through the heavy grey Washington fog today. The cramped motel room started to glow very softly now. The dark red shadows were finally gone from the room. They were replaced by a soft, warm morning grey today. Clara looked down at the wobbly, cheap wooden table now. The rusted leather suitcase was still sitting wide open today, but it looked entirely different in the new light now. It didn't look like a dark, hungry mouth anymore today. It was just an old, empty and battered leather container. All the legal folders were packed away safely inside now. The bundles of letters were in Clara's small bag today. The minimum wage receipts were finally hidden from sight now. The ghosts of the past were leaving the room today. They were dissolving in the new, bright morning sun now. Evelyn stood up from the small, squeaky wooden chair today. Her old bones made a quiet, tired, creaking sound now. She didn't look like a dark shadow anymore today now. She looked like a woman made of pure light today. The deep, heavy lines on her face were softer now. Her dark eyes were clear and very steady today now. She had carried a mountain for 19 long years now. Now she was finally standing on a flat ground today. She looked out the window at the long highway now. The sunlight hit the peeling floral motel wallpaper today now. It turned the faded pink roses into bright gold today. The dust in the air danced in the light now. Clara felt a strange new sensation in her chest today. It wasn't the sharp, biting cold of deep grief now. It was the slow, steady heat of new hope today. She looked at the property deed again, right now today. The bright blue ink was shining in the sun now. The paper felt thick, expensive, and very real today now. It didn't feel like a cheap bank notice anymore now. It felt like a solid piece of the earth today. She could smell the faint, clean scent of ink now. She looked at the heavy brass key today. Now, it was shining like a small, beautiful golden star now. This wasn't a dream from a storybook anymore today now. It was a real hard-earned second chance today now. It was bought with 14 years of honest sweat now. "It is time to go," Evelyn said very quietly today. She didn't look back at the messy, burned bed now. Clara nodded and stood up very slowly right now today. She felt the massive weight of her sister's love now. It was heavier than any mountain of debt today now. She reached out and touched Evelyn's tired arm now today. The canvas jacket was still a little damp today now, but the woman inside was incredibly strong today right now. They were ready to leave this room behind now today. They were ready to leave the ash behind today now. Clara grabbed her small bag of salvaged items today now. She made sure the brass key was safe today now. They walked toward the thin wooden motel door now today. Evelyn reached out and turned the heavy cold lock now. The metallic click sounded like a final quiet goodbye today. She pulled the door open and stepped out now today. The freezing rain had stopped an hour ago today now. The air was crisp, clean, and very sharp now today. They stood on the concrete walkway together now today. The distant interstate was starting to hum loudly now today. Big trucks were moving freight across the country today now. People were driving to work in the busy city now. The world was waking up like always. Today. Now. Today. But for Clara, the world was entirely new today now. She breathed in the smell of wet green pine now. It was the cleanest air she ever tasted today now. The sun hit the puddles in the parking lot today. They looked like shattered pieces of a silver mirror now. Clara looked at her sister's scarred hands right now today. They were resting quietly at her sides today, right now. They were done scrubbing floors for a long while now. They were going to build something beautiful instead today, now. Clara reached for Evelyn's hand and held it now today. The calluses felt like a warm, solid promise today now. They walked toward the old, dented silver car now today. The tires crunched on the gravel and dry dirt today. The fog was completely gone from the valley now today. The sky was a deep, brilliant and American blue today. Clara got into the driver's seat right now, today. Evelyn sat quietly in the seat beside her today now. They looked at each other one last time, today, now. There were no more secrets in the air now today. Just a long, open road ahead of them today now. Clara turned the key in the ignition right now today. The engine sputtered, then started with a roar, now today. She shifted the car into drive today, right now, today. They pulled out of the motel parking lot now today. They left the red neon sign far behind now today. They drove toward the quiet green suburbs today, now today. Toward the old greenhouse waiting in the sun, now today. The long 19-year night was finally over right now today. The morning had arrived, and it was beautiful now today. Family is almost always misunderstood as a group of people who never leave your side. We usually think of it as constant presence and shared holiday meals. But the story of Evelyn and Clara Vance teaches us something much more profound. The bitter smell of ash is now replaced by the sweet scent of morning pine. True family is the person who stands in the gap during your absolute darkest hours. It is the silent guardian who absorbs the heavy blows so you don't have to. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is choosing to disappear into the cold shadows. Evelyn chose to become the villain in Clara's eyes, to preserve her sister's light. Protection is rarely a loud performance for an audience of strangers watching from afar. Have you ever considered how much someone might be secretly sacrificing just to keep you safe? We live in a world that is obsessed with outward success and public validation. We praise the famous artists in the galleries, but often ignore the workers scrubbing floors. Evelyn Vance carried the physical weight of 19 years of manual labor on her back. Her scarred hands were the true price of Clara's clean and successful life. Her silence was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of iron will. There is an incredible dignity in working the hardest jobs to pay a debt. She didn't need a shiny gold plaque to feel she actually mattered to the world. Her reward was simply watching her sister paint canvases under the warm morning sun. This is the quiet goodness that keeps the broken pieces of our world together. It is the strength to survive the mud so someone else can fly. It is incredibly easy to judge a person based on a few angry whispers. We look at the surface of a tragedy and immediately decide the outcome. Clara spent 2 decades feeding her hatred with a story that was false. She let her wounded pride blind her to the staggering devotion of her sister. But tonight, that pride finally died on the floor of a cheap motel. Redemption is a painful process that requires us to admit we were terribly wrong. It is about letting go of the comfortable anger to find the difficult truth. Forgiveness is not a gift for others. It is a release for yourself. Does a second chance ever truly arrive too late if it brings healing? The long 19-year night is finally over for these 2 resilient sisters. If this story touched your heart or changed how you think about sacrifice, please subscribe. Share this video with a friend or a sister who really needs to hear this message. We would love to hear your personal thoughts on this emotional journey of resilience. The heavy brass key is a solid symbol of a future that is finally free. Have you ever misunderstood someone you love based purely on what you saw on top? Leave a comment below and tell us how you managed to find your way back. Until next time, remember to stay humble and always look for unseen goodness. Never believe that a quiet act of kindness is too small to matter. Turn on your notifications so you never miss another story of human connection. Your support truly helps us tell more stories about the incredible and resilient human spirit. Some doors open exactly when they were always supposed to open for us.